The bell above the door of the community hall had not rung so many times in a single afternoon since the year of the great flood. And now on the second Saturday of November, the whole town of Marrow Bend was packed into that hall, shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke and the sour breath of frightened men. At the front of the room, on a table someone had dragged from the church basement, sat a single pale pie with a lattice crust the color of amber, and behind it stood a woman with flour dried to the creases of her knuckles, and a stillness about her that made the loudest men in the county go quiet, without quite knowing why. Elias Crandall, of the Crandall Provisioning Company, stood beside her in a coat that cost more than most of them made in a season, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he believes he has already won, and every soul in that hall was waiting on the word of a woman they had spent a full year calling a fool. They wanted her to save them. That is the plain truth of it. The men who had laughed at her $7, the wives who had crossed the street rather than nod to her, the boys who had thrown gravel at her drying racks, they had all come to that hall because the harvest had failed them and she was the only one with anything left, and now they hung on the fate of a pie. But the verdict on Hannah Weir had already been rendered long before that afternoon, and it had been rendered not by any man in that room, but by the trees on the hillside and by a season of quiet listening. And to understand what she said next, you have to go back to the march. She came down the ridge road with everything she owned in the bed of a borrowed wagon. She was 31 years old that spring, a widow of 2 years with no children and no people left within 400 miles. And she had come to Marrow Bend because it was the last place her savings could reach and still buy anything at all. What her money reached was the old Pruitt place, 40 acres of stony hillside on the wrong side of the creek, a house with a sagging porch and a chimney that drew badly, and a stand of 40-odd walnut trees, so old and so neglected that the whole town regarded them as a standing joke. The Pruitts had let those trees go to ruin across 3 generations. Nobody harvested black walnuts anymore, not for money, because the hulls stained a man's hands black for a month, and the shells were hard as river stone, and the meat inside had to be picked out in pieces no bigger than a fingernail. The English walnut had come into the markets years before, thin-shelled and sweet and easy, and the old native trees on the Pruitt Hill were considered a nuisance, good for shade and nothing else. Their nuts left to rot in the grass each autumn, where the squirrels and the hogs got what they wanted. Hannah bought the whole of it, the house and the hill and the trees, for less than the price of a good mule, and the men at the general store shook their heads and said among themselves that a woman alone on that hill would not last one winter. That phrase followed her everywhere those first months. A woman alone. They said it the way they might have said a lamb in a wolf year, with a pity that was mostly relief that they were not her. She had not chosen the trees. She had chosen the price. But the trees came with the ground, and in her first week walking that hillside, she found the old drying loft in the barn, its slatted racks gray with age, and she understood that once, long ago, somebody had made a living from those trees and had known how. In late October of that first year, when the frost came hard one night and split the green hulls open on the branches, she watched the nuts begin to fall, and she gathered a bushel of them into her apron and carried them to the porch and cracked one with the flat of a hammer, and the meat inside was black walnut meat, oily and dark and fierce with the flavor that filled the whole back of her throat. Nothing at all like the mild, pale English nuts in the store. She stood there on the sagging porch, with her mouth full of it, and something in her went very still, the way it did when she was working a thing out. But she did not know yet what she knew, that is, the shape of it. She had the answer in her hand and could not yet read it. It was the auction at the Hollis granary that made her a laughingstock in earnest. Old man Hollis had died in the summer, and his stock was sold off that autumn, and among the lots was a great pile of black walnuts, near 300 pounds of them by the weigher's scale, that Hollis had gathered in some hopeful mood the year before and never done a thing with. Worse than idle, they were frost-cracked and dark. Many of the hulls burst and gone moldy on the outside, and the auctioneer near threw them in as an afterthought, saying, "Who will give me $1 for the walnuts?" And the whole crowd laughed, because everyone knew black walnuts were worth nothing, and these were spoiled besides. Nobody bid. The auctioneer dropped his price to a joke, and Hannah Weir raised her hand and said, $7, in a voice that carried across the whole yard, and the laughter that followed was the kind that has teeth in it. $7 for 300 pounds of ruined nuts, they said. The widow's lost her senses, and a big red-faced grain man named Tobias Renfrew, the richest farmer for 6 miles and the loudest voice in any room, laughed harder than anyone and called out that he would give her $1 an acre to plow those walnuts under and plant something a Christian could eat. She paid her $7 from a purse that had precious little left in it, and she loaded the sacks into her wagon herself, one at a time, 40 pounds a sack. Her back bent under each, and the men watched her do it, and not one of them moved to help. A woman alone, they said, and turned back to the bidding. It was in the granary yard that Elias Crandall first spoke to her. He was down from the city that week, a buyer for the Crandall Provisioning Company that supplied the hotels and the rail dining cars along the whole northern line, a smooth and well-fed man with a warmth in his manner that was as practiced as a card trick. He came to her wagon while she was tying down the sacks, and he touched his hat, and he said, in the kindly tone a man uses on a child, that he admired her thrift, but that she ought to know those nuts would break her heart, and that if she ever tired of the labor his company bought orchard land cheap for its shade timber and would take her hillside off her hands, he named a figure. It was a low one, dressed up as charity, framed as a favor to a woman who could not know better. And Hannah looked at him with her plain gray eyes, and she said, "Only I believe I'll keep it a while yet." And she climbed up onto the wagon seat and drove off with 300 pounds of ruined walnuts and $7 poorer, and the whole town laughing at her back. Crandall watched her go, and there was a flicker across his practiced face, not quite a frown, the look of a man who has offered a fish a hook and been surprised to see it swim on by. The first labor of those walnuts near broke her. She hauled the 300 pounds up to the drawing loft and spread them on the old slatted racks, and then she began the work of hulling. And there is no work on a farm meaner than hulling black walnuts by hand. The hulls were half rotted, and they stained her hands and forearms a deep tobacco brown that no soap on earth would lift, so that for weeks she went about looking as though she had dipped her arms in dye to the elbow. She built a hulling trough from an old cattle chute and worked the nuts through it with a spade and her boot heels, and she washed them in creek water. Gone so cold it made her fingers ache to the bone, and then she spread them to dry, and then when they were cured came the cracking. She sat on her porch in the long November evenings with a flat iron and a hammer and a bucket, cracking one nut at a time, picking the black oily meat out of the shell in fragments, and doing the arithmetic in her head. She reckoned it took her the better part of an hour to crack and pick a single pound of meat, and a pound of meat came off maybe 3 pounds of whole nuts, and there was no market that would pay her a wage worth the hour. She did the sum 100 times on those cold nights, and it came out the same each time, and the sum said she was ruined, that she had bought herself nothing but stained hands and a winter of aching fingers. And one night she set down the hammer and put her face in her brown ruined hands, and came as near to weeping as she had come since she buried her husband. But there was a thing that stopped her, and it was a small thing. She had let a handful of the cracked meats fall to the porch boards one evening, and in the gray of the next dawn she found a red squirrel on the rail, bold as brass, its cheeks packed full of her walnut meat, and it looked at her without the least fear and went on eating, and it came to her, watching that creature choose her ruined nuts over all the good acorns and English walnuts in the county, that the thing in her hand was not worthless. It was only that she had been trying to sell it, as it was, 300 pounds of hard, black shells, when nobody wanted it, as it was. She sat back on her heels in the cold, and she looked at the little animal fattening itself on the very thing the whole town despised, and she thought, "It is not the nut they will pay for, it is what I do with it. The value is not in the tree, the value is in the hands." And that thought, small as a coal under ash, she banked down inside herself and kept warm, and she picked up the hammer again. It was the old woman from the next ridge who taught her how to read the trees. Her name was Sophia Vaska, and she had come from the old country as a girl and buried 2 husbands on that ridge, and was regarded by the town with a mixture of respect and superstition. For she kept bees and knew herbs, and spoke in a soft accent that made her plainest words sound like proverbs. She came walking down the creek road one afternoon in early December, with a jar of honey as a neighbor's gift, and she was the first person in Marrow Bend to set foot on Hannah's porch without a smirk on her face. She looked at the drying racks and the stained hands and the bucket of picked meat, and she did not laugh. She said in her soft way that when she was a girl, her grandmother made a bread with these dark nuts that a rich man would sell his horse for, and that the town was blind because the town had forgotten. Then she said the thing that Hannah kept for the rest of her life. She said, "The land does not shout its worth, child. It only whispers, and it whispers longest to the one who has stopped talking long enough to hear." She said the reason nobody made money from the black walnut was that they all fought its hard shell and its stain, and tried to make it into the easy nut it would never be, when the whole secret was to stop fighting and let the dark nut be dark, for its darkness was its dowry. And then Sophia Vaska did a practical thing worth more than all her proverbs. She took a fragment of the picked meat and rolled it between her fingers and held it under Hannah's nose, and she said, "You are cracking these to sell by the pound like a fool. You must not sell the nut. You must sell the taste of it, baked into a thing that no store can copy. Make what my grandmother made, then let them come to you." That winter and into the spring Hannah learned to bake. She had always kept a decent kitchen, but she had never baked with intent, and now she set herself to it, the way she set herself to any hard task, by observation and patience and the willingness to fail 40 times. She learned that the black walnut meat, so mean to gather, gave up a flavor to a pie or a bread or a cake that the mild pale English nut could not touch, a deep bittersweet richness that lingered, and that a single pie needed only a cup of the precious meat, so that her 300 pounds of ruined nuts was in truth a store of pure gold if she rationed it a cup at a time. She did the arithmetic again on a spring evening, and this time the sum came out altogether different, and she sat a long while looking at the figure she had written, because the figure said that she was not ruined at all. She said nothing of it to anyone. She banked that coal deeper and kept it low. The boy came to her in the mud of April. His name was Tim Aldous, and he was 10 years old, and the youngest of a hard-luck family down in the creek bottom. A quiet, watchful child whose father drank and whose shoes did not fit. And he took to appearing at the edge of Hannah's yard and watching her work with a gravity beyond his years. He never laughed at her. That alone set him apart from every child in Marrow Bend, for the town's boys had made sport of throwing gravel at her drying racks all through the autumn. Tim only watched, and then one day he came and picked up a fallen nut and cracked it and started picking the meat without being asked. And Hannah gave him a slice of bread and molasses and did not send him home, and after that he came most days. He named the 2 big old trees at the top of the hill, the biggest and oldest of all her 40 trees, a great gnarled patriarch of a walnut, with a trunk 2 men could not reach around. Tim called that one grandfather, and he said it the way you would name a person, and Hannah found she thought of it that way too. After that, the old tree standing calm and enormous over all the rest, dropping its dark harvest without hurry or complaint. A thing of profound and ancient dignity that had outlasted 3 generations of men who called it worthless. Through that spring and summer, Hannah stopped fighting the hill. That was the change in her, the thing Sophia had named. She stopped wishing the trees were English walnuts. She pruned the old patriarch and the trees around it with care, cleared the choking brush from their roots, mended the drying loft, and let the trees do what 40 years of neglect had not stopped them from doing, which was to bear. She watched the way the frost cracked the hulls in the fall and learned to gather at exactly the right hour. she built better racks. She learned that if she cured the meat slow in the cool dark of the loft, the flavor deepened, the way Sophia said everything worth having deepened in the dark, and she perfected her pie until the crust was amber and the filling was a dark custard shot through with those bittersweet dark meats. And she made a walnut bread from Sophia's grandmother's telling that filled a whole house with its smell when it baked. And still she said nothing. The town went right on, pitying her. Tobias Renfrew told the story of her $7 at every gathering as the funniest thing in the county, the widow and her rotten nuts. And the wives crossed the street, and Hannah let them. Being right, she had come to understand, was its own kind of reply, and needed no other. The banked coal caught fire in October at the county harvest fair, and it caught because of a stranger. Hannah had brought 3 of her pies and 2 loaves of the dark bread to the baking tables, not to win a ribbon, but because Sophia had said, "Let them come to you," and Hannah had reasoned that a fair was where they came. She set her dark pies among the pale pretty pies of the town wives, and she stood back, and for most of the morning the town wives who knew her looked at her offerings and sniffed and passed on by, because they knew whose they were and knew she was a fool. But there was a man at the fair that day who did not know her, a cook named Mr. Baya. Dupree, who had come up from the Grand Hotel in the city 40 miles south to judge the baking and to buy for his kitchen, and he moved along the tables tasting with the bored eye of a man who has tasted everything until he came to Hannah's dark pie. He took one bite and stopped. He took another. "What?" He asked whose this was, and when Hannah stepped forward he looked at her the way no one in Marrow Bend had looked at her in a year and a half, which is to say he looked at her as a person of consequence. He said he had eaten pie in 3 cities, and had never eaten the like of this. And he asked what was in it, and when she told him black walnut, he said that no store in any city sold black walnut baking because no one would do the labor, and that scarcity, he said, was the very thing that made it precious. He bought all 3 pies, on the spot, at a price that made the town wives standing near go silent, and then he bought both loaves. And then he wrote out a standing order, 10 pies a week, to be sent down on the rail to his hotel, through the whole holiday season, at a price per pie so far beyond anything anyone in that county had heard of, for a pie that Tobias Renfrew, who was standing at the cider table, choked on his cup. Hannah wrote her name in the man's book with a steady hand, and she felt the whole yard turn to look at her, and she did not smile. She only did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic this time filled her with a quiet that was almost fear, because the sum was very large indeed. The word ran through Marrow Bend like fire through dry grass. Within a fortnight, the same wives who had crossed the street were finding reasons to walk past Hannah's gate, and one by one they came to ask, with a stiffness in their manner, whether she might sell them a pie, whether she might teach them, whether those old trees on their own backlots were the same kind. And Hannah was courteous to every one of them, and gave nothing away about her methods, for she had learned the worth of what her hands knew. By the end of that month she had orders she could not fill, and had taken to keeping a list, and the list of those waiting for a weir pie grew longer each week, so that folks in town, half in wonder and half in spite, began to say that the widow on the hill had a waiting line for pies now, as though such a thing had ever been heard of in Marrow Bend. She hired 2 of the Creek Bottom women to help with the picking, and paid them a fair wage that they sorely needed. And she paid young Tim in coin now for his after-school hours, and his shoes fit at last. But the more her fortune turned, the more Elias Crandall of the Crandall Provisioning Company took an interest, and the interest was not kindly. Crandall came back to the valley in November, and this time he came to her hill. He climbed to the porch steps in his fine coat, and he did not speak of shade timber now. He had heard, he said, of her little success, and he congratulated her most warmly. And then he laid out his proposition, which was that his company should like to buy her entire operation, the hill and the trees and the recipes and her name upon the pies, and run it at a scale a lone woman never could. He named a figure that was, for Marrow Bend, an enormous sum, and he watched her face for the greed he was certain of finding there. Hannah heard him out, and she said, in her plain, quiet way, that she was not for sale, that the hill was hers and the hands were hers, and she meant to keep both. Crandall's warmth cooled by a degree. He said she was being sentimental, that a woman alone could not hope to meet the demand, that his company controlled the rail freight and the city hotels both, and could make things very hard or very easy for a small producer as it chose. And that was the first of the 3 tightening waves. When she still refused, the rumors began, and they came from nowhere. Anyone could name that the widow's pies used spoiled nuts, that folk had taken ill, that her hill water was foul, and Hannah watched a few of her town orders fall away and knew whose hand was behind it. And then came the 3rd wave, the hardest, and it did not come by any scheme of Crandall's at all. It came by the weather. The blight came in the late summer of the following year, and it took the whole county's orchards, but Hannah's. It began as a canker in the English walnut trees down in the valley, a fungus that ran from tree to tree through the wet, warm summer, and by autumn it had killed or ruined near every English walnut and every apple in the low country, the pretty easy orchards that the whole of Marrow Bend had staked its living upon. And it came down over the county like the open door of a furnace, sudden and total. Tobias Renfrew, who had 200 grafted English walnut trees that were the pride of the county, watched every one of them turn black and drop its leaves in August, and he was ruined worse than any man, for he had borrowed against the crop. But the blight did not touch the black walnut. The old native trees on Hannah's stony hill, the very trees the town had called a nuisance for 3 generations, had a hardness bred into them by 10,000 years of that ground, and they stood untouched and green while all the fashionable orchards in the valley died. And in October the frost cracked their hulls, and grandfather at the top of the hill dropped the heaviest harvest of dark nuts Hannah had ever gathered. The land, Sophia said when she came to see it, remembers what the farmers forget. The men had forgotten the old tree because it was hard, and the hard tree was the only one left standing. Now the whole county needed what only Hannah had. The hotels and the rail dining cars, cut off from their walnut supply, sent buyers into the ruined valley, and every one of them was steered up the creek road to the widow on the hill. And behind them, sensing the turn, came Elias Crandall for the last time. But it was Tobias Renfrew who came first, and he came humbled. He climbed her porch in a coat gone shabby. The loud men made quiet, and he stood turning his hat in his big red hands, and he said he had lost everything, that his family would not eat through the winter, and that he had heard she was hiring pickers and hulling crews for the great demand, and he asked, with a shame that near closed his throat, whether there might be work on our hill for a ruined man who had once laughed at her $7. Hannah looked at the man who had led every laugh against her for 2 years, who had called her a fool in every gathering in the county, and she was quiet a long moment. Then she said there was work, and a fair wage for it, and she said it without a scrap of triumph in her voice. And Tobias Renfrew put his face in his hands and wept on her porch, and she let him. And when he was done, she gave him bread and molasses, the same as she had once given the boy. Which brings the telling round again to the community hall on that 2nd Saturday of November, and the single amber pie on the church table, and the whole town packed in, shoulder to shoulder, waiting on Hannah Weir. Elias Crandall had called that gathering. He had gone to the town council with a smooth proposal that his company should buy exclusive rights to the entire black walnut harvest of the valley, which meant Hannah's harvest, and set the price for pies and meat and bread throughout the region, and he addressed it as salvation, saying that only a great company could organize a ruined county and feed the hotels and bring money back into Marrow Bend. And the desperate town, having nothing left, had half a mind to let him. He had spread it about that the widow could not possibly supply them all, and that she would gouge them in her hour of power as any of them would have gouged her. He stood at the front of that hall, and he made his case with all his practiced warmth, and then he made his mistake. Turning to press her, meaning to prove how her small operation could never meet the county's need, He said that he knew for a fact she had brought in only 412 pounds of meat off that hill this season, and that it could not be stretched to feed a county. And the hall went quiet, because Hannah had told no one that figure. She had told no living soul the weight of her harvest. There was only one way Elias Crandall could have known it to the pound, and that was by paying someone to creep her drying loft and weigh her stores in the dark. And every man in that room understood it in the same instant that the fine man from the city had been spying on the widow, counting her nuts by lantern light to know just how to break her. Hannah let the silence sit. Then she spoke, and her plain voice carried to the back wall. She said, "Mr. Prant, Crandall was right, that she could not feed the whole county alone, and that no one could, and that the answer had never been for one hand to hold the harvest, whether that hand was his or hers." She said the old black walnut trees stood on a dozen hills in that valley, on the back lots of half the folk in this room, trees they had all been taught to call worthless, and that the meat was not the hard part, and never had been, that the hard part was the labor and the knowing, and that she would give both away. She would take no exclusive price and sell no rights to any company, hand. She would teach any family in Merrill Bend to hull and cure and bake the dark nut the way Sophia Vasca's grandmother had taught it, so that every household with an old tree in its yard might feed itself and sell to the hotels besides. And for the meat off her own hill, she would charge her neighbors only the wage of the hands that picked it. Not a cent for the nut itself, for the nut, she said, was never mine to sell. God grew it on a hill that was here, before the Pruitts, and will be here after all of us. And a thing you did not make is not a thing you can own. I only learned to listen to it. So, can you? The tide turned in that hall in a single breath. It was Tobias Renfrew who stood first, the loud man who had laughed loudest, and he took off his hat and he said, loud as he had ever laughed, that Hannah Weir was the finest neighbor in the county, and that any man who took the city buyer's coin was a coward, and one after another the men of Merrill Bend took off their hats. And the wives who had crossed the street now crowded around her, and Elias Crandall found himself standing quite alone at the front of a room that had turned its back on him. He gathered his fine coat about him, and he said something about sentiment and folly, and no one heard it, and he walked out of the hall and down the ridge road and out of the valley, beaten not by any court or any weapon, but by simple decency, which was the one thing his company had never learned to buy. The rains came clean the next spring, and the blight burned itself out. And up and down the valley the old despised black walnut trees, tended now instead of scorned, dropped their dark harvest into a county that had learned at last to read it. Sophia Vasca lived to see it, and she came to Hannah's porch one October evening with the low sun gold on the hill, and she watched young Tim Aldous, taller now, gathering nuts under the great old tree he still called grandfather, and she took Hannah's brown and calloused hand in her own, and she said, "You see, child, the land whispered, and you were the one who stopped talking long enough to hear it. It was never the nut that had worth, it was the listening." And Hannah Weir, who was no longer the fool on the hill, nor the woman alone, but a fixture of that place, respected and rooted and home, stood on her mended porch in the gold light, with the old tree dropping its dark gifts into the grass, and she thought that the arithmetic had come out right in the end, though never in the column she had first reckoned it. And she watched the boy carry a full basket up toward the loft, and she was content.